Welcome to the history section.
Okay, let's unpack this. History tells us that in 865, a pretty significant geopolitical shift was about to happen on the island of Britain.
And this whole thing is kicked off by the arrival of, well, a huge and very organized force of Vikings.
Right. And these aren't your typical raiders, these are seasoned warriors. They've been systematically pillaging through the lands of the Franks.
So they're coming from Western Francia. They're leaving the fortified bridges of Charles the Landless because they're looking for, I suppose, an easier target.
In easier territory, exactly. And that territory was Britain.
And the island they found was an absolute patchwork of power. It seems like it was completely incapable of presenting a unified front.
It was basically an invitation to conquest. If you were to look at a map of Britain in 865, it's less a nation and more, a collection of rival claims.
All built on centuries of fighting and shifting borders.
Absolutely. We can break it down into maybe four main spheres of influence, and each one is completely wrapped up in its own local feuds.
Okay, so let's start in the north. What was the situation there?
In the north, you had the ancient Pictish tribes, and they were in a constant struggle against the Scoti.
And the Scoti were migrants, weren't they? Essentially pirates from Ireland.
Yes, they'd sailed over and established themselves on those cold, mountainous shores. That regional conflict was consuming all their resources.
So the north was already fractured before the Vikings even showed up. But the political heartland, the Anglo-Saxon south, was maybe even more fragmented.
Critically fragmented. The south was divided among 7 different kingdoms. You had the major players, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria. But they all saw each other as rivals first, allies second.
There was no real cohesive national identity then.
None at all. Dynastic ambition came before everything else.
And then farther to the west, you had the groups who had held out against that Anglo-Saxon push for centuries.
Indeed. The craggy southwestern coasts were still stubbornly in the hands of the Welsh. And these are the descendants of the native Britons, mixed with Irish settlers and the old Roman population.
So their identity is really rooted in that memory of Roman Britain.
Deeply rooted. They trace their lineage back to figures like the 4th century Roman general Magnus Maximus.
Why was Magnus Maximus such a potent symbol for them?
Well, he represented the last sort of gasp of Roman authority on the island. In the late 4th century, he was a general who was proclaimed emperor by his troops right there in Britain.
And he took the legions to the continent to try and claim the whole empire.
He did. He failed. He was executed. But in Welsh memory, he became Maxen Weldig, a founding figure for their royal dynasties and a powerful symbol of independence.
So that lineage gave them a kind of historical justification for their resistance.
A deep one. They saw the Anglo-Saxons as, well, just interlopers.
Yeah.
And this fueled that constant tension between the two groups.
And that tension physically manifested itself in what must have been an incredible feat of engineering for the time. Offa's Dyke.
Offa's Dyke is a staggering piece of infrastructure. It's basically a massive political statement that just screams, stay out.
It was a Mercian fortification built by King Offa in the 8th century, so almost 100 years before the Vikings arrived.
And the research suggests it was a hard border, specifically between Mercia and the Welsh territories, built after the Welsh had devastated Mercian lands with raids.
It was described as extending from one sea to another. What did that actually look like on the ground?
It was designed for defense, but also for clear demarcation. You had a massive ditch on a western side, the side facing Wales, in front of a 20-foot wall of earth.
So it wasn't garrisoned like Hadrian's Wall.
No, it was more a declaration of permanent separation. It marked where Mercian law ended and Welsh territory began. It really speaks to the power of Mercia at that time, their ability to organize labor and project power.
And while the Anglo-Saxons are building these huge dirt walls against the Welsh, the North actually saw some success in unification right before the Viking threat emerged.
That's a crucial counterexample. About 20 years before the Vikings landed, Synod Mac Ailpin, the ruler of the Scoti kingdom of Dalriada, attacked the Picts.
And he didn't just conquer them, he folded their land into his own kingdom.
Exactly. He's the foundational figure of Scottish history. We know him as Kenneth MacAlpin or Kenneth I. His dynasty, the House of Alpin, ruled this new, united northern kingdom from Scone.
So you have a relatively unified kingdom emerging in the far north, but just destabilizing fragmentation everywhere else.
Tremendous fragmentation.
Let's focus on that shifting power dynamic in the Anglo-Saxon lands. Mercia had been dominant, but then places like Kent and East Anglia started to break away. How did Wessex capitalize on that?
Well, Mercia's strength was in its inland trade and agriculture, but they overreached militarily. By around 860, their authority had really declined.
And Wessex filled that vacuum.
They did, not through sheer size at first, but through dynastic stability and military competence. The King of Wessex annexed Kent and Sussex, which meant the entire southeast of England was, for the first time, united under a single throne.
So Wessex was small but consolidated, a single effective political unit.
Crucially, yes. But the overarching problem was still there. There was no high king. No one figure who could pull all the fragmented Anglo-Saxon forces together against a major threat.
In fact, the local kings probably resented Wessex's growing power more than they feared some distant pagan Vikings.
Precisely. They were short-sighted. Each king was worried about his own throne. And this vacuum of leadership, this patchwork of rivalries, was exactly the weakness the Great Army was sailing toward.
And in 865, that threat arrives. The command structure alone, it sets a tone of focused, overwhelming force.
It does. They landed in Wessex, commanded by three brothers, Halfdan, Ivar, and Ubi, sons of the notorious Viking pirate Ragnar Lodbrok.
And that connection to Ragnar Lodbrok, whether it was strictly true or more of a legend, that immediately established their ferocity.
It gave them legitimacy. But what's really fascinating is the leadership dynamic, especially around Ivar, known as Ivar the Boneless.
The name itself is so striking.
It is. The research suggests he may have had a severe bone disease, something that weakened his legs and made it difficult for him to walk.
And contemporary accounts say he was often carried into the fight on a shield.
Yes, fighting with a long spear. So this physical limitation, he transforms it into a source of psychological intimidation.
That must have been a devastating image for the Anglo-Saxons. He's lifted above the battle, like a platform director of chaos.
Exactly. To them, he would have seemed almost supernatural, a chieftain who wasn't walking the earth like other men, but was carried like some kind of idol, directing his warriors from a vantage point only he had.
And beyond the leaders themselves, the whole army carried this potent psychological weapon, the Raven Banner.
The Raven Banner was pure psychological and religious warfare, all embodied in a piece of cloth. It was the symbol of the Norse god Odin.
Odin, the king of battles, who could supposedly blind and deafen his foes.
And control the winds and the sea, awaken the dead. He was the god of battle frenzy, the berserker rage. His two ravens, thought and memory, flew over the world and brought him intelligence.
And the banner itself had its own powerful lore, which we know because the 9th century Welsh monk John Asser wrote down.
Asser's account is incredible. It confirms how seriously the Anglo-Saxons took this. He wrote that the three sisters of Ivar and Uba wove that banner between dawn and dusk on a single day.
So it's already imbued with this kind of unnatural power from its creation.
And then there was its alleged predictive power. According to Asser, if the Vikings were going to win a battle, the embroidered raven would seem to flutter as if it were alive.
But if they were going to lose, it would just droop, lifeless.
And Asser doesn't dismiss this. He actually confirms, and this has often been proved to be true.
That's profound. The idea that an Anglo-Saxon chronicler genuinely believed this pagan symbol could prophesize, it must have been terrifying.
It set up an immediate existential conflict. The banner was a sign of the ancient religions, creating this potent crisis for the Anglo-Saxons, who had been officially Christian since 664.
But that Christian faith was spread unevenly, wasn't it?
Very unevenly. The old ways still lingered, in the mountains of Wales, deep in the forests, and around the struggling churches of Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria.
This is where something like the epic poem Beowulf can really give us insight into that 9th century mindset.
Beowulf is perfect for this. It dates from roughly this period, and it reflects that tension. You have the Christian king in his well-lit hall on the hill, and in contrast, the monster Grendel, prowling the dark swamps, is described as a kinsman of Cain, an enemy of God.
And the poem admits the fragility of that Christian conversion.
It does. The poet explicitly says that in desperate times, facing Grendel, the warriors reverted to their past. They made offerings at pagan shrines. The poem calls it reaching for their heathenish hope.
So the memory of paganism was still deep in their society.
And so in 865, the arrival of the Vikings isn't just a territorial invasion, it's perceived as a hellish attack. These warriors were threatening to pull the Christian Anglo-Saxons back into the dark waters of the ancient religions.
The fight was for their land, but also for their soul.
Fundamentally, yes. Losing meant reverting to a pagan shadow they had only just escaped.
And that context of religious terror really sets the stage for the swiftness of the Great Conquest. Ivar and his men made their first move in East Anglia.
They landed with overwhelming force and a clear strategy. Secure logistics first. They didn't even have to fight a battle at first.
The local king just saw the size of the army and cut a deal.
A swift, temporary one. In exchange for keeping his throne, he gave the great army food, shelter for the winter of 865, and most importantly, horses in the spring.
Let's just pause on those horses. That's a game changer, isn't it?
It's the critical pivot point. Earlier Viking forces were sea-borne raiders. By getting horses, they transformed into a highly mobile force.
So they could cover huge distances, bypass defenses, and appear where they were least expected.
The East Anglian king essentially handed them the key to conquering the rest of Britain.
So after wintering and re-equipping, the Vikings marched north into Northumbria.
And they capitalized perfectly on that internal strife we mentioned. Northumbria was in the middle of a civil war between two men claiming the throne, Osbert and Ella.
A gift for Ivar.
An absolute gift. The Vikings seized York in 866. The two rivals finally stopped fighting each other and united their forces, but it was too little, too late.
What happened when they met the Great Army?
By the end of 867, Northumbria was completely overrun. The united force was defeated, York was captured, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records immense slaughter.
And the cultural consequences were severe. You mentioned the monastery at Whitby.
Yes. A huge cultural loss. This was the historical site where the English church had unified back in 664. The Vikings laid it to waste. It would remain a ruin for 2 centuries.
Having crushed Northumbria, they moved south into Mercia.
The former powerhouse. And Mercia, feeling the pressure, was forced to appeal to its neighbor, Wessex.
This is where we first really meet King Ethelred of Wessex and his younger brother, Alfred.
Alfred was about 20 at this point, serving as his brother's second-in-command. They answered the Mercian call for aid and met the Vikings at Nottingham,
But the sources say no heavy fight occurred there.
which strongly suggests a standoff followed by a transaction. A temporary peace was arranged, almost certainly involving a huge payoff, Danegeld.
So the Vikings were bought off.
They were. This let them withdraw peacefully, return to York to regroup for a year. It was a classic Viking strategy. Take the money, rest, and hit a softer target later.
And during this intervention, Alfred secures a significant political advantage for the future.
He does. A testament to his early political skill. He marries the daughter of the Mercian king, Elswith,
Which gives him a future claim on Mercia.
or at the very least, enormous influence over it. It was a key strategic move for a young prince who understood that dynastic links were as important as shield walls.
The Vikings spend that year in York,
Hmm.
and when they return, they head straight back to East Anglia.
And this time, they show their brutal disregard for that initial treaty. They returned, killed the king who had given them winter quarters, St. Edmund, and took the land for themselves.
So the strategic situation is now dire. The Vikings control the entire north and east.
Which places Wessex directly in danger. The war was coming home to Ethelred and Alfred.
Which brings us to the defense of Wessex, starting in 871. This was a year of grinding attrition, wasn't it?
Perhaps the most desperate year in the kingdom's history. The Great Army marched into Wessex in January, in the middle of winter.
And they faced immediate setbacks.
On January 4th, the Anglo-Saxon army was defeated at Reading. The Vikings had fortified the site, and the Anglo-Saxons suffered significant casualties.
But they managed a crucial, if temporary, triumph just 4 days later.
Yes, at the Battle of Ashdown, a momentary burst of hope. King Ethelred was famously preoccupied attending Mass and refused to leave until it was over, forcing Alfred to launch the attack without him.
So Alfred led the charge.
He did. Asser says he rushed forward like a wild boar, charging up the hill. The battle was brutal, but they pushed the Vikings back, forced them into a rout. It was a huge psychological victory.
But it came at a devastating cost.
The sources say the army was severely weakened, with many thousands killed. These were Pyrrhic victories Wessex just couldn't afford.
And the tide turned back very quickly.
Within 2 weeks, the Great Army won at Basing, then again at Meryton. Viking reinforcements arrived. Halfdan took control of London. The continuous attrition was just breaking the Anglo-Saxon ability to resist.
And it took its toll on the leadership. King Ethelred died of illness in April of that year.
Which immediately transferred power to Alfred, who was only in his early 20s. He inherited a kingship and command of a struggling, shrinking army.
And we have to be careful with contemporary accounts here. Asser calls him victorious in virtually all battles, but that feels like later myth-making.
The immediate reality was crushing defeat. Alfred promptly lost another major fight and was forced to sign a temporary peace treaty. He had to buy time with a massive payment of Danegeld.
Meanwhile, the Vikings used that time to solidify their control over the rest of the island.
Exactly. They firmed up their dominance in Northumbria. Then in 874, they moved back into Mercia and took that whole kingdom for their own. Mercia ceased to exist as an independent kingdom.
Ivar the Boneless had died by this point, but the leadership was still strong under Ubin Guthrum.
They were becoming institutionalized occupiers. And facing this overwhelming power, Alfred makes a radical decision in 878 that must have looked like surrender. He went into hiding.
It was a strategic calculation born of desperation.
And genius. He'd seen that a war of attrition meant the end of his kingdom. By early 878, the situation was bleak. Anglo-Saxon refugees were sailing away from the island. The Vikings were camped on the Avon.
And Alfred and his men were living in the swamps of Athelney.
Yes. Asser describes it as a restless life in great distress. They had nothing to live on except what they could forage through raids on the Vikings. Alfred chose the long view.
He traded immediate territory for long-term survival.
And it's this period of exile that gives us that famous story, that one about the cowherd's cakes.
Right. Alfred is hiding out, told to watch the cakes, but he's so preoccupied with his kingdom's fate that he lets them burn.
And the housewife comes back and scolds him mercilessly.
We know that's a later insertion into the story, so how should we interpret it?
We should look at the function of the myth. The story's essence is about creating this memory of Alfred's humility and virtue. He, the king, accepts a scolding from a simple woman. It served to elevate his character, cementing him as this God-provided deliverance from the pagan threat.
This is why chroniclers insisted his face shone like an angel's.
Exactly. But before Alfred emerges from the marshes, the first good omen occurs while he's still in hiding.
The Battle of Sinuit.
Yes. Ivar's last remaining brother, Ubi, was killed. And the Anglo-Saxon forces, led by the Ealdorman Oda, not only won but captured the Raven Banner.
The very symbol of Odin's power. That's not just a military victory, that's a religious one.
Absolutely. The fall of Ubi and the capture of the banner signaled that the tide had turned. Heartened by this, Alfred finally emerged from the marshes with a strong, desperate army.
And in the late spring of 878, he meets the Great Army, now led by Guthrum, at Edington.
This was the turning point. It was a decisive victory achieved through the disciplined use of the Anglo-Saxon shield wall. Asser describes Alfred fighting fiercely. The Vikings suffered great slaughter and fled.
Following that defeat, Guthrum agreed to a treaty, but with a highly symbolic condition.
He agreed to convert to Christianity, a brilliant piece of statecraft by Alfred. Guthrum brought 30 of his strongest warriors with him, and they were all baptized.
So this symbolically ends the threat of the pagan gods.
And places the Viking leader under the same religious jurisdiction as Alfred.
The resulting agreement was the Treaty of Wedmore. And it didn't expel the Vikings, it officially divided England.
It established a lasting political geography. The south and southwest remained Anglo-Saxon, ruled by Alfred. Guthrum and the Vikings were granted independent control of Northumbria, the eastern coast, and the eastern half of Mercia. This whole region became known as the Danelaw.
So why did the Vikings accept this? It wasn't just the one battle, was it?
It's not solely. The victory was decisive, but it came after a deeper shift. The Vikings had been in England for nearly 15 years at this point. They had evolved.
From raiders to settlers?
They had rooted themselves into the English countryside. They had married Anglo-Saxon women, had children, planted farms. They were losing their piratical edge.
They were ready to settle down.
They were. And accepting the new faith offered them stability, farms, families. It was intensely pragmatic. Alfred's men were equally exhausted and just wanted to get back to their fields.
So the treaty was a compromise born of mutual exhaustion.
Absolutely. It gave Guthrum a new home, and it gave Alfred the survival of Anglo-Saxon culture in the south.
Let's talk about the Danelaw itself. What did independent control actually mean?
It was a region governed by Scandinavian law, which was very different from Anglo-Saxon law, especially in things like land tenure and local governance.
The heart of it was the 5 boroughs.
Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford. Powerful, fortified Viking centers. Justice there was often delivered by 12 lawmen, experts in Danish customs, not by royal sheriffs.
And land ownership was different too.
A major difference. There was a higher proportion of sokemen, free peasants who owned their own land outright. This created a legal structure that was arguably more egalitarian and certainly more stable for the Viking veterans who settled there.
The treaty established a clear boundary.
Yes, a line running up the Thames, then following the River Lee, and eventually following the old Roman road Watling Street, which became the official border.
So while Alfred did have to put down a few more Viking attempts later on, this division into the Anglo-Saxon south and the Danelaw north would stand for decades.
It did. The treaty gave Guthrum his new home, and it gave Alfred the largest Anglo-Saxon kingdom yet to pass to his son Edward. He secured the survival of his culture, but he did it by accepting a permanent foreign presence on the island.
And it's for these achievements that Alfred was remembered with such deep gratitude.
He was remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a peacemaker and a legislator. The 12th century historian John of Worcester called him renowned, warlike, victorious, the zealous supporter of widows, orphans, and the poor, most dear to his people, gracious to all.
Alfred's genius, then, was recognizing that the great army had become the great settlers. He turned their desire for war into a desire for fields.
And by giving them a home, he bought the survival of his own line and laid the cultural foundations for what would eventually become a single England. He didn't defeat them completely, he incorporated them.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.